It was a night that was supposed to be filled with fun and laughter. My husband and I had been invited to a party, one of those casual get-togethers with close friends that we often attended. The evening started just like any other, with everyone in high spirits, sipping drinks, and catching up on the usual gossip. The house was beautifully lit, the music was perfect, and the air was filled with excitement. But little did I know that this night would turn into something far more intense, filled with emotions that I hadn't even imagined. As the night wore on, the conversation started to shift. The laughter grew louder, the drinks kept flowing, and I noticed that there was an energy in the room I couldn't quite place. My husband and his friends had always been close, but tonight there was something different in their behavior. The teasing was a bit more flirtatious, the glances exchanged were longer, and the tension in the room was almost palpable. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the alcohol making everyone loosen up. But I was soon to learn that there was more to it. At one point, my husband and his friends gathered in a corner, whispering among themselves. I didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just some inside joke, or maybe a plan to surprise us with some prank. But when they returned, there was a change in their demeanor. My husband came up to me, smiling, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel uneasy. "We're going to try something new tonight," he said, his voice combat firm. Before I could ask what he meant, the other men in the room started approaching their wives and girlfriends, suggesting the same thing. It took a moment for it to sink in, but when it did, my heart began to race. They wanted to swap. The idea of it was outrageous, something I had never even thought about. But as I looked around, I saw the women's faces, a mixture of surprise, hesitation, and curiosity. I felt a mix of emotions, confusion, fear, excitement, and even a strange sense of curiosity. My mind was racing with thoughts of what this would mean for my marriage, for my relationship with my husband. Was this something he had wanted for a long time? Had he been hiding this side of him from me? And more importantly, why was I even considering it? The room seemed to grow quieter as each couple processed the suggestion. Some of the women looked as shocked as I felt, while others seemed to be intrigued. My husband didn't pressure me, but his eyes were on me, waiting for my reaction. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to run to leave this madness behind, but another part of me, perhaps the part that had always craved something exciting, something different, was tempted to see where this would lead. The first couple to agree was a shock. They simply nodded to each other, stood up, and moved toward another couple. It happened so quickly without much conversation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Suddenly, the room felt even smaller, the air thicker, and I couldn't breathe. I looked at my husband, searching for some reassurance, some explanation, but all I saw was anticipation. He leaned in and whispered, "Only if you want to." It was my decision, I realized. He wasn't forcing me, but the very fact that he was open to this, that he was even suggesting, it made me question everything. Did I want to go through with it? Could I handle the consequences? What would this mean for us after tonight? One by one, couples began to swap partners. The room had transformed into something far more intimate, far more charged than I could have ever anticipated. My hands were shaking as I watched, unsure of what to do. But then something unexpected happened. One of the men, a friend of ours, came up to me. He was always charming, always kind, but tonight he was looking at me in a way he never had before. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking through the noise in my head. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was. He offered me his hand, and I hesitated for just a moment before taking it. There was no turning back now. I felt my husband's eyes on me as I stood up, but I couldn't meet his gaze. My heart was pounding as I let myself be led away, the room spinning around me. We found a quieter corner, away from the others, and for a moment everything slowed down. I could still hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses, but it felt distant now. The man in front of me, my husband's friend, was calm, gentle even. He wasn't rushing me, wasn't pushing me into anything. We talked for a while about nothing in particular, just small talk to ease the tension. But then the conversation stopped, and the air between us grew heavier. He leaned in, his hand brushing against mine, and for a moment I felt a spark. It was wrong, I knew that, but in that moment I didn't care. I let myself get lost in the sensation in the heat of the moment. His lips met mine softly at first, then with more urgency. I felt a flood of emotions: guilt, desire, confusion. My mind was telling me to stop, but my body was responding to the situation in a way I hadn't expected. I thought of my husband, of what he was doing at that very moment, and the thought sent a strange thrill through me. Was this what he wanted? Was this some kind of test? Or had he simply opened a door neither of us could close now? The night continued in a blur of emotions. I found myself tangled in a situation I never thought I'd be in, surrounded by people who were just as caught up in the heat of the moment. It was thrilling, confusing, and terrifying all at once. And as the night drew to a close, I couldn't help but wonder what the morning would bring. The party ended, but the feelings didn't. As we drove home in silence, I couldn't bring myself to look at my husband. He didn't say a word either. His eyes focused on the road, but I could feel the tension between us. What had we done? What had we become? When we finally got home, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. We didn't talk about it, didn't mention the party or the swapping. We simply went to bed, lying next to each other in the dark, the weight of the night pressing down on us. I wanted to ask him how he felt, if he regretted it, but I couldn't find the words. And so we lay there in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The days that followed were strange. We avoided the topic, both of us pretending as if nothing had happened. But the tension was always there, just beneath the surface. Every time we looked at each other, I could see the questions in his eyes, and I knew he could see the same in mine. It wasn't until a week later that we finally talked about it. One night after dinner, we sat down, and my husband asked me the question I had been dreading. Do you regret it? I didn't know how to answer. Did I regret it? Part of me did, of course. The guilt had been eating away at me ever since that night, and I knew things would never be the same between us. But another part of me, the part that had been excited, that had felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, couldn't bring itself to regret it entirely. I don't know, I admit it, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, and for a moment I thought he would leave it at that. But then he surprised me. I don't regret it, he said softly, and my heart skipped a beat. I stared at him, shocked by his words. How could he not regret it? How could he be okay with what had happened? He took a deep breath and continued. It wasn't what I expected, but it made me realize something. We've been stuck in a routine for so long, going through the motions. That night, as strange as it was, reminded me of how much I want to be with you. How much I love you. I don't need anything else, just you. Tears welled up in my eyes as I listened to him. I had been so afraid that what had happened would tear us apart. But here he was, telling me that it had brought him closer to me. I love you too, I whispered, and for the first time since that night, I felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wasn't easy. We had to rebuild the trust, to work through the emotions that night had stirred up. But in the end, we came out stronger. The experience, as bizarre and unexpected as it had been, had opened our eyes to what really mattered. Looking back now, I realized that night wasn't just about swapping partners. It was about confronting our fears, our desires, and our relationship. It forced us to communicate in a way we hadn't in years, to face the truth about ourselves and our marriage. And while it was a night I'll never forget, it's also a reminder that love is complicated, messy, and full of surprises. But as long as we have each other, we can get through anything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more. Thank you for being part of this journey with me.